I want to talk about the position from which I speak. I want to start there because it's a little bit different. I speak from the space of African museum making and African museum transformation, of African museum education, and of the work of what we are calling decolonizing African museums. And also of working with museums in Germany and elsewhere in Europe on how to deal with their colonial legacies. So I want to talk from the vantage point of challenging colonial legacies in the museum. So that here decolonizing is not just a redecoration, but asks us to think about how we can understand the museum on an anti-colonial basis. And this field, for those of you who follow it in the last few years, has been extremely action-packed, fast-paced, an absolutely dynamic field of museum transformation, of developments almost every day. And if I can just give you a little bit of a potted history of that. Emmanuel Macron's speech in Burkina Faso in November 2017, leading to the Savoie report on restitution 2018. The return of 26 artworks that had been looted in Benin, in Dahomey in 1892, to Cotonou in 2021. And I've seen film footage of the jubilation and the celebration of the return of those artworks. There's been recent action in Germany on the Benin bronzes. The Benin bronzes in Germany will be returned. An agreement has just been signed with the Nigerian government. The Benin bronzes represent an important test case on restitution. And I know that our Greek colleagues have an interest in that matter. The Smithsonian are going to return all their Benin bronzes. But here we are talking about restitution, not just about the return of stolen objects, of loot and artworks. Not just from contexts of injustice, what the Germans call contexts of injustice, but indeed including all colonial situations. This is about ownership, sovereignty, and about building new international partnerships. There have been major policy developments, as many of you will know, on restitution in the Netherlands, in Belgium. And in Britain, this has tended to be limited to small university museums or local museums, except until the last few days. The director of the Victoria and Albert Museum, Tristram Hunt, has called for a change in the heritage law that would enable restitutions. Germany will return all human remains from colonial contexts. It is now absolutely accepted that the dead have no place in anthropological museums. A major new international museum program, the Museums Lab, is on the go, funded by Germany, this year in 3 modules involving the building of partnerships between African and European curators. The art historian Benedict Savoy has called this moment an important crack in the wall. The great colonial wall has started to collapse. But I want to put it to you that we are witnessing a time in our lives that is even perhaps more significant, in which we are witnessing a fundamental transformation in what we mean by museum. And I want to put it to you that we are seeing a transformation from a concept of museum as containment to a museology of enablement, And I want to first talk to you briefly about what do I mean by containment. And we can go back to the 19th century taxonomies and classificatory systems of the modern museum. But we won't go there. Of how that museum is precisely about governance. But this was a disciplinary museum in which the world was divided into those with cultural history and to the people without history. This was the museum of among the disciplinary museums were museums of archaeology and the canon of art history. And those who had been colonized were allocated to ethnology and anthropology. So what we also have at work here is the civilizational museologies of societies with civilization and societies deemed to be without civilization. And this has also been a field of a kind of ideology of the universal museum, which has unfortunately had a singular European, Western-driven concept of universality, and which was the major means by which the major museums in the world made an argument to hold on to their collections from colonial contexts. And so what I want to say to you is that when we think about the museum, we must think about the disciplinary contests that are taking place, about why it is that when societies change, history museums emerge, and that the people who had been denied senses of pastness and denied a sequence of history lay claim to the history museum. That historicizing is a means of declaring your freedom. And so the new museums in the United States, the National Museum of African American History and Culture, a history museum. The South African museums are history museums. And there are struggles in the field of art history about which societies have art history and how artworks were made ethnological in the colonial museum. But I want to put it to you that we have a very different concept of museum that has been emerging. The Museum of Enablement. We see it in South Africa in the example of the District 6 Museum, where the museum is not the building, the museum is not the collection, but the museum is the process. The museum is the gathering of the people. The museum is a domain of mobilization. This is what we see in Latin America, where the major debates on the new museology is not happening in English, it is happening in Spanish and Portuguese. You see this in the Museu da Maré in Rio de Janeiro. You see it in Salvador de Bahia. And of course, as we speak, next month, ICOM gathers again over the difficult question of the so-called definition. And that struggle is precisely one between an older museum of containment and a new museum of enablement. Finally, I want to put it to you that when we think about restitution and all of these developments, I want to suggest that restitution is not an event to be managed through the demands of events management by government. But restitution offers a new platform for museum making, where museum is about partnerships and relationships, where we have to distinguish between what we mean by restitution and what we speak of as repatriation, where repatriation is merely a giving and restitution involves building claims and African agency. And finally, we need to think about the ways in which our processes of restitution and our debates on restitution are currently segregated into separate debates. Here is the debate on the restitution of human remains. And we all agree that human remains collecting was violent. But on the other hand, we talk about artworks and material culture that we automatically place in a framework of care. And often, the human remains and the material culture were collected on the same field expeditions, transported on the same ships. And I want to put a case for conjoining those projects of restitution so that we undertake restitution with a sense of partnership, open-mindedness, and a desire to build a new world after colonialism. Thank you.